Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're starting with something a little softer, a little fuzzier, and maybe a little smellier than our usual parade of inbred monarchs and disastrous beheadings. We are going to float through the strange, quiet, and often bewildering world of animals in the Middle Ages. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Find that comfortable spot on the pillow where your neck doesn't hurt. Let your shoulders drop. Take a deep breath in and let it out. We aren't going anywhere fast tonight. We're just going to wander through a muddy medieval village, peek into a drafty castle kennel, and maybe sit quietly in a monastery garden while a monk tries to teach a cat to read, because why not? The medieval world was crowded, not just with people, though if you've seen the sanitation records, you know there were plenty of those packed into tight spaces, but with animals. They were everywhere. They were in the fields, obviously, but they were also in the streets, in the churches, in the beds, and occasionally, quite literally, on the dinner table while they were still alive. If the chef was feeling particularly avant-garde, the line between pet, farm equipment, and roommate was, let's say, extremely blurry. To understand the medieval mindset, you have to realize that silence wasn't really a thing. Sure, there were no car alarms or notifications pinging every 4 seconds, but there was a constant, low-level hum of biological noise. Roosters screaming at dawn because they have no snooze button. Pigs grunting in the alleyways because waste management was basically just let the pig eat it. Horses clattering on cobblestones. It was a very organic soundscape. And within this noise lived people who had incredibly complex, often contradictory relationships with the creatures around them. They loved them, they feared them, they ascribed deep theological meaning to them, and then they usually ate them. Let us start with the creature that likely holds the title for most confusing reputation in the medieval era, the cat. Now, if you own a cat today, you know they are essentially small, furry dictators who allow you to live in their house. In the Middle Ages, the job description was a bit different. Cats were, first and foremost, employees. Their primary KPI was rodent control. If you were a cat in 1250 AD and you weren't catching mice, you were essentially unemployed, and there wasn't exactly a severance package. The medieval granary was a buffet for rats, and rats meant starvation. So a good mouser was worth its weight in, well, maybe not gold, but certainly oats. But the cat had a bit of a PR problem. On one hand, you have the sweet, purring companion curled up by the hearth. On the other hand, you have the church occasionally side-eyeing the cat and wondering if it's actually a demon in a fur coat. Pope Gregory IX, a man who clearly needed to relax, famously associated cats with heretical rituals in the 13th century, specifically black cats, because why not demonize the one animal actually helping you not die of plague. It's that classic medieval logic. This animal is independent, active at night, and stares at nothing in the corner. Must be Satan. Despite the occasional bad press and the very unfortunate superstitious rituals involving cats, which we won't get into because we want to sleep, not have nightmares, people still kept them. They couldn't help it. There's something universally soothing about a creature that sleeps 16 hours a day. It's a lifestyle we can all aspire to. We have beautiful evidence of this affection in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Monks, who were supposed to be focusing on the glory of God and copying sacred texts, often got distracted by their cats. There is a famous poem written by an Irish monk in the 9th century about his cat, Panger Ben. It is genuinely sweet. The monk writes about how he hunts for words, and his cat hunts for mice. They are colleagues. Just two guys working late, enjoying the quiet. I love to rest, he says, better than any fame, which is a mood. Then you have the other side of the manuscript evidence. Paw prints, literal ink-stained paw prints, stamped right over the text of a holy book. You can just picture the scene. It's 1420, brother. Thomas has spent 6 months copying this Bible. He leaves the room for 1 minute to get some pottage, and the monastery cat, sensing an opportunity for chaos, walks right through the ink pot and across the Gospel of Luke. And because parchment was expensive, you had to skin a sheep to get it. They couldn't just throw it away. They just left it. So, for eternity, that cat's indifference to theology is preserved. It's a nice reminder that cats have never cared about your hard work. Let's drift away from the monastery and head toward the castle, where things get a bit more expensive. If the cat was the pet of the scholar and the peasant, the dog was the ultimate status symbol of the aristocracy. But we aren't talking about labradoodles here. We are talking about hunting dogs, greyhounds, wolfhounds, spaniels. To say nobles were obsessed with their dogs is an understatement. They liked their dogs significantly more than they liked their peasants, and often more than they liked their own children. And honestly, considering the mortality rate and general behavior of medieval children, the dogs were probably a better investment. These dogs lived better than 90% of the human population. They had their own staff. I'm not joking. There were kennel boys whose entire existence revolved around making sure the Lord's favorite greyhound was comfortable. They had to clean the kennels daily, ensure fresh straw was laid down, and, get this, keep a fire burning in the kennel during the winter so the dogs wouldn't get chilly. Meanwhile, the kennel boy is probably sleeping in a drafty hallway, but the dog is toasty warm. Priorities. There were entire manuals written on how to care for these dogs. One famous text, Le Livre de Chasse, by Gaston Phoebus. It's basically the what to expect when you're expecting for medieval dog owners. Gaston was a French count who really loved hunting. He wrote that dogs are the most noble beasts and basically insinuated that if you do unlike dogs, you're a bad person. He suggested talking to them softly, massaging their paws, and feeding them bran bread mixed with milk. But it wasn't all massages and milk. These dogs had jobs, too. They were weapons. A medieval hunt wasn't a relaxing walk in the woods. It was a military operation against a stag or a boar, and boars are mean. A wild boar is essentially a tank made of muscle and bad attitude. So, the dogs wore armor. Little chainmail coats or leather collars with spikes on them to protect their necks from tusks. Imagine a greyhound dressed up for battle. It's absurd, but also kind of adorable in a deadly sort of way. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you next time. Let's talk about the lapdogs. This is where the whole inbred thing really starts to show, because royals have always loved a genetically questionable aesthetic. Ladies of the court would carry small dogs right in their sleeves. These sleeve dogs, or comforters, served two purposes. One, they were cute and warm. Two, and this is the gross part, they were flea traps. The idea was that fleas would jump onto the dog instead of the lady. These little dogs were pampered to an embarrassing degree. They were fed roasted meat from the table, slept on silk cushions, and wore collars made of velvet and gold studs. There are even records of royals commissioning jewelry for their dogs. Imagine being a peasant starving in the mud, and you see a spaniel trot by wearing a ruby collar worth more than your entire village. You would probably feel a certain type of way. But that was the medieval social contract. God put the king in the castle, the peasant in the field, and the dog on the velvet cushion. Now, let's float down from the castle, past the moat which we woe unlook at too closely because it's filled with things you do unwant to seed into the village. Here, the relationship with animals was less about pampering and more about survival. The peasant's most valuable possession wasn't his house or his clothes. It was his ox or his cow. These animals were the tractors of the Middle Ages. An ox could pull a heavy plow through the thick clay soil of Europe. No ox, no plowing. No plowing, no wheat, no wheat. Everyone dies. Simple math. Because these animals were so vital, they lived intimately with the family. In the typical longhouse, the layout was open plan. Humans on one end, animals on the other. Maybe a little drain in the middle, if you were fancy. In the winter, this was actually a feature, not a bug. cows are big, and they generate a lot of body heat. Having a couple of cows in the living room was basically central heating. Sure, the smell of manure was overpowering, but you'd be warm while you smelled it. And after a few years, you probably just went nose-blind to the ammonia. The pig was another fixture of peasant life. Pigs are smart, adaptable, and they eat trash. They were the ultimate recyclers. A medieval pig didn't look like the pink, hairless sausages we see on cartoons. They were leaner, hairier, and much faster. They roamed the forest in the autumn, eating acorns, practice called pannage. There's something very pastoral about the idea of a swineherd taking his pigs for a walk in the woods to find nuts. It sounds lovely until you remember that wolves also like pork. But the pig's intelligence sometimes got it into trouble. And this brings us to one of the most bizarre and hilarious aspects of medieval legal history: animal trials. We need to really settle in for this concept, because it defies all modern logic. In the medieval mind, the world was a hierarchy ordered by God. Everyone had a place and a duty. If a person committed a crime, they were punished. But what if an animal committed a crime? What if a pig, in a fit of pique, bit a child? Or a swarm of weevils ate the crop? In a modern world, we'd call animal control, or by some pesticide. In the medieval world, they called a lawyer. Yes, animals were put on trial. Formal, legal trials with judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a pantomime. It was taken with deadly seriousness. The records are dusty and dry, which makes them even funnier. You'll see an entry for a trial in France in 1386, where a pig was accused of attacking a child. The pig was arrested. It was put in jail. Not a pen, but the actual human jail. It was probably fed the same bread and water as the human prisoners, which, honestly, might have been a step down from the acorns. The trial proceeded like any other. Witnesses were called. Did you see the defendant, the pig, on the day in question? Yes, my lord. He looked agitated. The defense attorney would try to argue for the pig. Maybe the pig was provoked. Maybe the pig was just having a bad day. They would argue about intent. Can a pig have a guilty mind? The theologians and lawyers debated this, while the pig likely sat in the dock, oinking inappropriately. If found guilty, and, let's be honest, the conviction rate for pigs was high, the animal was sentenced. And the sentence was usually death. But not just slaughter, execution. The pig would be dressed in human clothes, waistcoat, maybe some breeches, and hanged in the town square. Why? Why go through the expense of a lawyer for a sow? It wasn't because they thought the pig understood the legal nuances of assault. It was about order. A crime had disturbed the natural order, and the ritual of the law had to restore it. It was a performance for the humans, a way of saying, look, the law applies to everything. Chaos will not be tolerated, even if it has a curly tail. It wasn't just pigs. Rats were put on trial. Weevils were excommunicated by the church. Imagine being a bishop and having to draft an official letter of excommunication for a bug. I, Bishop of Autun, hereby command you, weevils, to depart this vineyard or face the wrath of God. And then they would wait. If the weevils didn't leave, the conclusion wasn't that the ritual failed. It was usually that the villagers had sinned too much and the weevils were a punishment. Or perhaps the defense lawyer for the weevils had made a really compelling point about their right to eat. One famous case involved rats who were summoned to court. They rats. Their lawyer argued that they could uncome because the local cats made the journey too dangerous. The judge actually accepted this as a valid excuse. Fair enough, he probably said. The defendants have a legitimate fear for their lives. Case delayed. You can't make this up. So, as we leave the courtroom where a rooster is currently being cross-examined, let's drift back to the countryside. The sun is setting over the medieval landscape. The sheep are being herded back into the fold. Sheep were the economic engine of places like England. The wool trade, they say, paid for the cathedrals. Those soaring stone arches, the stained glass, the chanting monks all of it, funded by millions of fluffy, bleeding animals eating grass in the rain. Shepherds were interesting characters. They spent days, sometimes weeks, alone with their flocks. They were isolated, living on the fringes of the village. Because of this, they were often seen as a bit mystical. They knew the weather. They knew the stars. And they knew their sheep. A medieval sheep wasn't just a white fluff ball. It was a rugged little beast. And the shepherd's life was mostly boredom, punctuated by panic when a wolf showed up. To pass the time, they played music. The stereotype of the shepherd playing a flute or pipe is actually true. It was to keep from going insane from the silence. As the night fully sets in, the nocturnal animals take over. The owl was viewed with deep suspicion. If you heard an owl hoot 3 times, someone was going to die. Or maybe the owl just saw a mouse. But in a world without electric light, the darkness was terrifying. It was full of demons and ghosts. Animals that moved in the dark were automatically suspect. The bat, a bird that has skin instead of feathers, clearly an error in creation or a spy for the devil. Yet, despite the fear, despite the weird trials and the fleas, there was a closeness. People touched animals constantly. They knew the texture of a horse's mane, the roughness of a cow's tongue, the sharpness of a cat's claws. We are so separated from that now. We buy our meat in plastic-wrapped styrofoam trays. We see animals, mostly, on screens. But the medieval person lived in a biological soup. They were part of the food chain, sometimes uncomfortably so. It's a humble history. No great battles were fought by the cows. No treaties were signed by the dogs, despite their high status. But the daily rhythm of life, the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, was regulated by these creatures. The rooster signaled the start of the day. The oxen dictated the pace of work. The cat guarded the grain, and the flea, well, the flea kept everyone humble. In the next part, we're going to look at the beasts that didn't actually exist, but that everyone believed in anyway. The unicorns, the dragons, and the very confused descriptions of elephants written by people who had clearly never seen one. Because if you think the trial of a pig is weird, wait until you hear about how they thought beavers behaved when chased. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more strange tales from history. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're just joining us, or if you drifted off somewhere between the monk's, cat, and the pig trial, don't worry. You haven't missed anything too urgent. We're really just sitting here in the dim light of a scriptorium. That's the fancy room where monks copied books, surrounded by the smell of parchment, oak gall ink, and the faint, dusty scent of old ideas. In part 1, we talked about the animals you could actually touch: the cows, the dogs, the litigation-prone pigs. But now, we're going to drift into the realm of the imaginary. Or rather, the realm of we haven't seen this animal, but a guy who knows a guy who went to Africa said it looks like this. So let's write it down. Welcome to the world of the medieval bestiary. A bestiary wasn't a field guide. If you took a bestiary into the woods, hoping to identify wildlife, you would end up very confused and probably eaten. These books weren't about science. They were about theology. Every animal was a symbol, a furry little allegory designed to teach you a moral lesson. Whether the animal actually existed or behaved that way was entirely beside the point. Facts were secondary to the vibe. Let's start with a creature you think you know: the unicorn. In modern times, the unicorn is a sparkly pastel-colored pony that hangs out on stickers and birthday cakes. It represents magic and dreams. In the Middle Ages, the unicorn was a bit more ... intense. It wasn't a horse. It was usually depicted as a goat, or sometimes a deer, but with that one massive horn, and it wasn't friendly. The medieval unicorn was a killing machine. It was incredibly fast, impossibly strong, and could impale a knight before he even got his sword out. It was the John Wick of the forest. But according to the bestiaries, this angry goat monster had one weakness, a specific, very creepy weakness. It could only be tamed by a virgin. The instructions were clear. If you want to catch a unicorn, you don't use a net or a trap. You take a young woman, sit her down under a tree in the middle of the woods, and wait. The beaver would then survive, sans testicles, to chew wood another day. And if another hunter chased it later, the beaver would supposedly roll over on its back to show it had nothing left to take, and the hunter would walk away in disappointment. The moral lesson. The monks said this taught men to cut off their vices and sins and throw them at the devil to escape his pursuit. A nice sentiment, sure, but you have to feel bad for the beaver in this hypothetical scenario. It's the most extreme defensive maneuver in history. You want these? Fine, take them. Let's float over to something larger, the elephant. Medieval artists loved drawing elephants. The problem was, 99% of them had never seen one. They were working off descriptions that had been translated from Greek to Arabic to Latin, probably by people who hadn't seen one either. It was a game of telephone played over 1,000 years. So, you look at these manuscripts, and the elephants are ... wrong. They look like horses with trumpets glued to their faces. Sometimes they have hooves. Sometimes they have paws. Sometimes their ears are tiny, and sometimes they look like dragon wings. And almost always, they are carrying a literal stone castle on their backs. Not a basket, a castle with turrets and archers. Because the texts said elephants were used in war and carried castles, the artists took it literally. So you have this poor, confused-looking animal trudging along with a piece of real estate balanced on its spine. The most pervasive myth about the elephant was that it had no knees. People believed an elephant's legs were just solid columns of bone. Because of this, the elephant couldn't lie down. To sleep, it had to lean against a tree. The bestiary then explains how to hunt an elephant. You don't shoot it. You find the tree the elephant likes to sleep against, and you saw halfway through the trunk. When the elephant comes back, after a long day of being a tank, it leans on the tree snaps, and the elephant falls over. Because it has no knees, it can't get up. It's just stuck there, like a turtle on its back, until the hunters come. This story is tragic, completely false, and very funny in a dark way. It also led to a frantic theological panic. If the elephant falls, how does it get up? The answer: a small baby elephant comes and helps it. This represented Christ helping fallen humanity. Again, the theology is sound, but the physics are a disaster. Then there is the pelican. If you've ever seen a pelican in real life, you know they are terrifying dinosaurs that will try to swallow a pigeonhole. They are not sentimental creatures. But in the Middle Ages, the pelican was the ultimate symbol of self-sacrifice. The story went that the mother pelican loved her babies so much that she would peck her own chest open and let her blood flow out to feed them or to revive them if they had died. This is the pelican in her piety. You see it carved into church altars, painted on shields, and woven into tapestries. In reality, pelicans have a spot of red on their beaks, or sometimes they press their bill against their chest to rest. A monk saw this from a distance, squinted, and said, "Look, she is feeding them with her own life force." And a legend was born. Meanwhile, the real pelican is just trying to digest a fish, completely unaware it has become the mascot for altruism. And we can't talk about medieval animals without mentioning the Bonnacons. Picture a bull, but with a horse's mane and horns that curl inward, making them completely useless for fighting. So, how does this magnificent creature defend itself? Well, when it gets scared, it turns around, tenses up, and it farts. But this isn't just any fart. The Bonnacon unleashes a jet of flaming, acidic dung that can travel for 3 acres and will scorch anything it touches. It's a biological flamethrower powered by bad digestion. The artists who drew this had a field day. You'll see these poor knights running for their lives, their armor melting as this weird bull-horse hybrid shoots fire from its rear end. The moral of this story is a bit unclear, but it's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unexpected weapon is the most effective. These stories are hilarious to us now, but they reveal so much about the medieval mindset. The world was a book written by God, and every animal, every plant, every rock was a word in a divine sentence. They weren't interested in biology. They were interested in meaning. And if reality didn't fit the story, well, too bad for reality. It shows us a time when imagination was more powerful than observation, and a good story was more important than a boring fact. Thanks for diving into the weird world of medieval bestiaries with me. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and maybe share this with someone who needs to know about the fire-farting Bonnacon. See you next time. Ever heard of a creature called the Bonnacon? It's this bull-like animal that medieval monks believed lived in the faraway lands of Asia. Now, it had horns, but they were totally useless for fighting because they curved inward. So, how did the Bonnacon defend itself? Well, when it was chased, it would turn around and unleash a stream of fiery, corrosive poop. Yes, you heard that right. Weaponized dung. The ancient texts, called bestiaries, are very clear about this. They claim this discharge could cover a distance of 3 acres and would scorch the hair off any pursuing dogs. The illustrations are just incredible. ULLC, a knight desperately trying to shield his face while this smug-looking Bonnacon looks back over its shoulder, firing a literal beam of excrement at him. It's pretty hard to find some deep theological meaning there. Maybe it's a metaphor for the dangers of foul language. Or maybe, just maybe, the monks drawing these things had a great sense of humor and needed a break from all the sad crucifixions. You can just imagine it. Hey, Brother John, you have to draw the farting cow again. You got it, Abbot. These books didn't just cover mythical beasts. They also delved into real animals, but with some very strange ideas. They thought newbies just spontaneously generated from flowers, or even rotting meat. Every creature, from the lion to the tiniest ant, held a secret meaning, a message written by God for humans to decode. The world was an enchanted, meaningful place. Sure, it was a world where elephants had no knees and beavers were self-castrating pacifists to escape hunters. When a medieval king wanted to show off his power, he didn't just buy a nice car. He started a menagerie, a royal zoo. For centuries, the Tower of London, which we mostly associate with beheadings and torture, was actually home to one of the world's weirdest zoos. Kings of England were constantly receiving exotic animals as diplomatic gifts. It was like, here's a peace treaty, and, oh, by the way, here's a polar bear. Yes, a polar bear. In London, in 1252, King Henry III received one as a gift from the King of Norway. They also had lions at the tower, but they weren't entirely sure what lions ate. Which is fine, but they also wondered if it might want some vegetables. For some reason, they decided to feed it only meat and wine. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, the poor elephant died after just a few years. It was buried right there in the stone courtyard of the tower, a magnificent creature of the sun and the savannah, ending its days drinking red wine in a damp English fortress, all because a king wanted to show off. It's a sad reminder that while the medieval imagination was vast and colorful, their practical knowledge had some pretty significant gaps. They could picture a dragon with perfect clarity, the scales, the fire, the hoard of gold, but they could unfigure out that an elephant might prefer some grass over a roast beef dinner. So as we metaphorically close the heavy leather cover of the bestiary, with dust motes dancing in the candlelight, we leave behind the unicorns and the Bonnacons. We step out of that imaginary world and back into the hard, cold reality of iron and stone. Because while the monks were inside, doodling, farting cows, the knights were outside, mounting their horses. And the animal they rode was no mere symbol. It was a weapon of mass destruction. In our next journey, we're going to explore the world of the warhorse, the Destrier, the absolute Ferrari of the Middle Ages. We'll find out how much they cost, spoiler alert, more than your house, how they were trained to bite people. Faces off in battle, and why a knight would often rather lose his wife than his prized warhorse. So get comfortable, fluff up your pillow, and let that image of a polar bear swimming in the Thames drift downstream, out to sea, and into the dark, quiet ocean. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Part 3: The Four-Legged Tank and the Bankruptcy of Knights. Hey guys! Welcome back. We've left the scriptorium now. The monks are asleep, or at least they're pretending to be while they sneak snacks in the dormitory. We are moving outside, into the cool, damp air of the stable yard. Can you smell it? That mix of hay, leather, cold iron, and, well, manure. It's the signature scent of the Middle Ages. Ode to feudalism. In the last part, we talked about imaginary animals that shot fire from their backsides. Now, we're going to talk about an animal that was very real, very expensive, and very likely to bite your face off if you looked at it the wrong way. We are talking about the Destrier, the medieval warhorse. If you watch movies, you probably have this image of a knight riding a massive, shaggy Clydesdale, one of those beer wagon horses with the feathery feet. He looks majestic. He gallops across the field, wind in his hair. In reality, that horse would be terrible for war. A Clydesdale pulse, it doesn't sprint and pivot. A real medieval warhorse was closer to a heavyweight boxer than a bodybuilder. Compact, muscular, and full of rage. The Destrier wasn't a pet. It was military hardware. It was the F-35 fighter jet of the 13th century. And just like a fighter jet, it cost an absolute fortune. Let's talk money for a second, just to set the scene. In the Middle Ages, a regular farm horse, the kind that pulled a cart, might cost you a few shillings. A decent riding horse, maybe a few pounds. A top-tier Destrier? You were looking at 80 to 100 pounds. To put that in perspective, a wealthy merchant might earn 10 pounds a year. A skilled carpenter might earn 2. Buying a Destrier was the equivalent of buying a Lamborghini, but a Lamborghini that you have to feed every day and that might die of colic if it eats the wrong weed. Knights were constantly broke, and this horse was usually the reason why. You couldn't just have one. If your horse got injured, or sick, or just tired, you needed a backup. So a knight on campaign would bring 2 or 3 of these monsters with him. It was a logistical nightmare. And you didn't even ride the Destrier to the battle. That's a rookie mistake. These horses were uncomfortable. They had a gait that would rattle your teeth out of your skull. Plus, you didn't want to tire out your Ferrari driving it on the highway. So, knights rode a smooth, easygoing horse called a palfrey for the journey. The warhorse was led alongside by a squire, empty and fresh, waiting for the violence to start. It's a funny image, the terrifying, armored knight bobbing along on a little pony, while his giant war machine trots beside him, probably trying to bite the squire's arm. And biting was a feature, not a bug. These horses were stallions. Intact males. They were naturally aggressive. Medieval horse trainers didn't try to train that out of them, they leaned into it. They wanted a horse that would trample infantry. They wanted a horse that, in the crush of a melee, would kick and bite the enemy. There are accounts of battles where the horses were fighting each other just as hard as the men were. Imagine trying to control 1,500 pounds of angry testosterone while wearing a metal bucket on your head that limits your vision to a tiny slit. You had to steer with your legs because your hands were busy holding a shield and a lance. It required an immense amount of skill. If you fell off, you were a turtle on its back, game over. Because these horses were so valuable, they got the best armor. It was called barding. At first, it was just chainmail draped over the horse, which must have been incredibly heavy. Later, they made plate armor for horses. Steel helmets for the horse's head, steel plates for the neck and chest. Picture the scene. You're a peasant conscript, holding a rusty spear. The ground starts to shake. And out of the mist comes a wall of steel. Not just men in steel, but horses in steel. They look like dragons. They are snorting, their hooves are churning up the mud, and they are moving at 25 miles per hour. You can understand why cavalry charges were so effective. It wasn't just the impact, it was the psychological terror. You don't stand in front of a moving car, and you definitely don't stand in front of a moving car that is actively trying to kill you. But for all their aggression, these horses were pampered. The bond between a knight and his horse was complicated. It wasn't the boy and his dog love. It was the respect a pilot has for his plane. You take care of it because your life depends on it. The horses ate better than the people. Oats, bran, peas, beans. When an army marched, the biggest logistical challenge wasn't feeding the soldiers, it was feeding the horses. A warhorse eats about 20 to 30 pounds of fodder a day. Multiply that by a few thousand horses, and you need a mountain of grain. Armies would literally stop moving because the horses had eaten all the grass in the area. The entire geopolitical strategy of a campaign could be decided by the question, is there enough hay over there? If a knight lost his horse, he ceased to be a knight in a functional sense. He became just another guy in armor walking in the mud. This was socially devastating. There were charity funds set up by kings specifically to help knights buy new horses so they wouldn't be embarrassed. The King's Remount Fund. It was like medieval insurance. Now, let's float down the social ladder a bit, from the Destrier to the Rouncey. The Rouncey was the Honda Civic of horses. It was the all-purpose, economy model. Squires rode them. Poor knights rode them. They carried the baggage. They weren't flashy, they weren't particularly fast, but they got the job done. If you were a messenger, you rode a Rouncey. If you were a slightly well-off farmer, you might have a Rouncey. The history books ignore the Rouncey because it's not sexy. No poet wrote epics about the Rouncey. But the Rouncey built the medieval world. It pulled the carts that carried the stone for the cathedrals. It carried the wool to market. It was the unsung hero, plodding along muddy roads, eating second-rate hay, and doing all the heavy lifting while the Destrier got the glory and the velvet blankets. Speaking of velvet, we have to mention the ladies' horses. Women in the Middle Ages, specifically noble women, were avid riders. But they rode palfreys. These were bred for one thing, smoothness. They had a special gait, an amble, where the legs on one side moved together. It's like a gliding motion. No bouncing. A lady would ride side saddle, which looks incredibly precarious and frankly dangerous, but they were experts at it. Their saddles were like chairs, with velvet cushions and intricate carvings. The horse was often draped in silk trappings that dragged on the ground. It was completely impractical, but it looked fantastic. And in the Middle Ages, looking fantastic was half the battle. There's a great contrast here. The knight on his twitchy, biting, psychopathic stallion, and the lady on her smooth, gliding, silk-draped palfrey. They ride out together for a hunt, the ultimate medieval power couple date night. And that brings us to the hunt. Because you can't talk about medieval animals without talking about the ones that were used to kill other animals. We already touched on dogs, but there was another predator that sat on the fist of the nobility. The hawk. If the horse was the car, the hawk was the wristwatch. It was the ultimate accessory. You carried it around even when you weren't hunting, just to show people you could afford one. Bishops brought hawks into church. There are records of nuns being told to stop bringing their hawks to the choir stalls because the birds were squawking during prayers. Imagine trying to chant a psalm while a falcon screams in your ear. Falconry was an obsession. And like everything else, it was strictly hierarchical. There was a law, or at least a very strong custom, about who could fly which bird. An emperor could fly an eagle. A king could fly a gerfalcon, huge, white, beautiful birds from the Arctic. A prince could fly a peregrine falcon. A knight could fly a saker. A lady could fly a merlin, a small, fierce little falcon. And a knave, that's a servant, could fly a kestrel. If you were a peasant and you were caught with a gerfalcon, you were in big trouble. That was like stealing the crown jewels. These birds were diplomatic gifts. When a king wanted to impress another king, he didn't send a gift card, he sent a team of white falcons from Iceland. The care involved in keeping these birds was intense. You had to man the hawk. This meant taming. But you don't tame a raptor like a dog. You break its will. The falconer would carry the bird on his fist for days and nights, constantly, never letting it sleep. He would stay awake with it. If the bird fell asleep, he would wake it up. It was sleep deprivation torture until the bird accepted the human as its master. Once manned, the bird lived on a perch in the great hall or in the bedroom. They were part of the domestic circle. They wore little leather hoods to keep them calm. These hoods were often decorated with beads and gold thread. A bird with a fancy hat. When they hunted, it was a spectacle. The party would ride out. Destriers, palfreys, dogs barking, horns blowing. They'd spot a heron or a duck. The hood comes off. The bird launches. And for a moment, everyone stops. The heavy, muddy, smelly reality of medieval life falls away, and they all look up. They watch this perfect, aerodynamic creature climb into the blue sky, fold its wings, and drop like a stone. It was violent, but it was also beautiful. It was a way for earthbound humans, stuck in their heavy armor and wool clothes, to touch the sky. But let's not get too poetic. Because once the bird caught the prey, the humans would rush over, retrieve the dead duck, and give the hawk a treat, usually the brain or the heart of the victim. A gruesome little snack to say, "Good job." Then the hood went back on, and the bird went back to being a prisoner on a perch. So, we've covered the horses that trampled people and the birds that hunted for sport. But what about the animals that no one wanted? The ones that weren't pets, or livestock, or symbols? The pests. The medieval home was an ecosystem. You had the people. You had the dogs. You maybe had a pig in the corner. But you also had the uninvited guests. Rats, obviously. Mice. But also insects. Lots and lots of insects. Fleas were so common that they were just a fact of life. There was no shame in having fleas. Everyone had fleas. The King of France had fleas. The Pope had fleas. It was the great equalizer. People wore fur-lined clothes, which were basically luxury condos for fleas. They had all sorts of remedies. They would scatter sweet-smelling herbs on the floor, lavender, meadowsweet, wormwood, hoping the smell would drive the bugs away. It didn't really work, but it made the room smell better than the pig, so that was a win. They also wore flea furs. This was a piece of animal pelt worn around the neck, the idea being the fleas would gather there, and you could then take it off and shake it out. A decoy garment. And then there were the worms. Intestinal worms. We don't need to go into graphic detail because we want to sleep, not feel sick. But let's just say that the medieval internal experience was crowded. Medical texts are full of recipes for deworming. Garlic, walnut shells, questionable chance. It was a constant battle for ownership of your own body. It paints a picture of a life that was never truly private. You were never really alone. If you weren't with your family, you were with your animals. If you weren't with your animals, you were with your parasites. The modern concept of personal space just didn't exist. As we wrap up this section, let's go back to the stable one last time. The horses have been fed. The grooms are sleeping in the straw, listening to the heavy breathing of the destriers. The hawks are on their perches in the castle, hoods over their eyes, dreaming of the sky. The castle cats are patrolling the granary, doing the Lord's work in the dark. It's a busy, breathing world. A world where human dominance was asserted every day, but was always a little bit fragile. One bad harvest, one plague, one horse tripping in a rabbit hole, and the whole system could wobble. In the next part, we're going to leave the land entirely. We're going to the water. We'll talk about the fish. The strange rules about eating beaver tails on Fridays. The monsters believed to live in the deep ocean. And the very real struggle of trying to keep a carp alive in a moat. So rest your head. Listen to the imaginary sound of a horse chewing hay. Chomp, chomp, chomp. Rhythmic. Slow. Peaceful. Part 4. The theological loophole and the carp in the moat. Hey guys. Settle back in. We are leaving the stables and the dusty menageries behind, and we are floating now into a colder, damper environment, the world of water. We are going to talk about the fish. Not just fish as food, but fish as theology, as architecture, and as an excuse to eat semi-aquatic rodents on Friday. The importance of fish in the Middle Ages is impossible to overstate. It was quite simply the meat substitute. And the medieval calendar was absolutely crammed with days when you couldn't eat meat. Fridays, of course, all of Lent, Ember Days, vigils before major holidays. If you added up all the fast days, you were looking at almost half the year when beef, chicken, or pork were strictly off the menu. The rule was simple: you couldn't eat warm-blooded flesh. This meant anything that lived on land and had blood that flowed when you cut it. But fish were considered cold, and therefore acceptable for the pious. This led to a fascinating period of history where religious lawyers basically became amateur zoologists, trying desperately to reclassify everything they wanted to eat as a fish. This is where the infamous beaver tail exemption comes in. You remember the beaver from Part 2, the poor creature with the self-mutilating defense mechanism? Well, the beaver was also useful on fast days. The reasoning went: the beaver spends most of its time in the water. Its tail is scaly. Therefore, its tail is like a fish tail. Conclusion: beaver tail is okay to eat during Lent. It's just brilliant, frankly. The ultimate legal loophole. Yes, I am eating a giant rodent, but I am only eating the part that looks sort of like a lizard, so God is fine with it. The same logic was applied to birds. Specifically, the barnacle goose. This goose breeds in the Arctic, and medieval people had never seen a barnacle goose nest or egg. They just appeared mysteriously in the winter. Since they had never seen a goose egg, they hypothesized that the goose didn't come from an egg at all, but hatched from a barnacle or grew on a piece of sea-drifted wood. Because it was born of the sea, it was declared acceptable to eat on fast days. The argument was basically, if we don't know where it comes from, we will assume it's a fish. You had similar arguments for puffins and other seabirds in coastal areas. They spend time in the water. They taste fishy. It must be okay. This illustrates the beautiful medieval hypocrisy, a deep devotion to religious rules, paired with an equally deep commitment to finding a way around them, preferably with gravy. But for the common person, and for the monks who had to feed hundreds of people, the primary source of fish wasn't loophole beavers, it was the managed freshwater pond. Every major castle, abbey, and wealthy manor had a fish pond or a stew. This was not just a scenic little feature. It was a refrigerator, a pantry, and a freezer, all rolled into one muddy hole in the ground. The best fish for these ponds were carp and pike. Carp are rugged. They thrive in muddy, low-oxygen water. They can sit there, growing fat and happy, waiting for the day they are needed for the fast day meal. The pike, a lean, mean freshwater predator, was also valued. Moats were often used as fish stews. Think about that for a second. The moat, which was used for defense, which received the runoff from the castle latrines, which was full of stagnant, dark water, that's where dinner came from. The fish in the moat were probably robust, to put it mildly. They lived a life of constant peril and questionable sanitation. The taste of a medieval moat carp was likely earthy. Monasteries were absolute experts in fish farming. They kept detailed records on how to stock the ponds, when to drain them, and how to transport the live fish. Transporting live fish was important because you couldn't keep food fresh for long. You needed to keep the fish alive until the moment you were ready to cook it. This meant carrying tubs of water and fish in carts over bumpy roads. It was not a low-maintenance task. If you were a peasant, you didn't have a fish stew. You had to go to the river or the sea. The rivers were common property, and people used complex fishing weirs, big traps made of woven branches, to channel the fish into a narrow area for easy netting. But the sheer demand for fish was devastating to the river ecology. There were constant complaints, even in the 13th century, that too many nets were being used, that the weirs were catching all the baby fish, and that the rivers were being emptied. It was one of the first environmental concerns in Europe, driven entirely by the need for Friday dinner. A more extreme and highly illegal fishing method was poisoning the water. Poachers would throw certain plants, like the mullein or the bark of a Spanish tree, into a small river. The poison would stun the fish, causing them to float to the surface, where they could be easily scooped up. It was efficient, devastating to the local ecosystem, and guaranteed you a trip to the stocks if you were caught. Let's now turn our gaze from the murky freshwater ponds to the wide, terrifying ocean. The open ocean was, to the medieval mind, a place of sheer chaos. On land, you had your bestiary, which told you what everything symbolized. In the sea, it was all conjecture, rumor, and the trauma of sailors who had seen things they couldn't explain. Medieval maps of the ocean are glorious because they are less about geography and more about fear. They are covered in sea monsters. Not just the edges, right in the middle of the Atlantic. The largest and most feared was the aspidacolone, or the giant turtle/whale. The story was that this creature was so huge that its back looked like a small, flat island. Sailors, weary after weeks at sea, would mistake the creature's mossy, barnacle-covered back for land. They'd anchor their ship and light a fire to cook dinner. The aspidacolone, feeling the warmth of the fire, would then dive, pulling the entire ship and crew down into the depths. This, like the beaver story, had a moral lesson: be wary of false comforts and don't trust the stability of the world. Also, maybe check the topography before you light a bonfire on a random island. Then you have the standard sea serpent. These were massive, mile-long dragons with fins. They were often described after sightings of giant oarfish or schools of eels, but in the medieval mind, if it was long and in the ocean, it was a dragon. Why wouldn't it be? And the mermaids? The medieval mermaid was not the gentle, singing Disney character. She was a harbinger of doom. She would appear to sailors, distracting them with her beauty and her song, only to lure their ship onto the rocks, where they would all drown. The bestiary said the mermaid could only sing when the wind was calm, and if she sang, it meant a storm was coming. She was beautiful, but she was a death sentence. These tales weren't just folklore. They were real navigational hazards. A sailor's fear of hitting a sea monster was just as potent as his fear of hitting a reef. Fear changes behavior. If the map said, "Dragon here," you sailed around it, even if you wasted a day. The most famous real-life monster was probably the giant squid, which was occasionally caught or washed up on a beach. It was instantly classified as the kraken. The size of a small mountain, with eyes like shields and tentacles that could pull down a mast. These were often explained in bestiaries as the remains of the biblical Leviathan, massive, ancient creatures that only God could control. For all the fear, there was also a genuine wonder. Medieval people were fascinated by seals and dolphins. Dolphins were seen as friendly, intelligent, and helpful. There are stories of dolphins guiding lost ships and rescuing drowning sailors. They were the good guys of the sea. And finally, let's close with the quiet life of the oyster. Oysters and mussels were the food of the coastal poor. They were easy to gather and cheap. But the nobles loved them too. This led to some early attempts at aquaculture, especially in France. They would plant wooden stakes in the sea, hoping that oysters would grow on them. This was one of the first examples of human intervention on the natural environment specifically for seafood cultivation. It was a messy, wet business. Imagine sitting on the cold shore, eating an oyster pulled from a tidal flat. It's slippery, briny, and cold. And you are eating it because your religion says you can't have chicken. It's a very humble, very medieval meal, linking the highest spiritual concern, fasting, with the simplest, dampest food available. As we drift away from the coast, we can hear the distant cry of the barnacle goose, trying to convince the local priest that it is, in fact, a scaly crustacean. The water is dark and cold. The sea monsters are still lurking, waiting for an unwary ship. We've now covered the creatures of the castle and the beasts of the water. But what about the quiet, humble heroes of the farm? In the next part, we are going to look at the work animals. The oxen that pulled the plow, the gentle milk cows, the sheep that gave their wool. These animals didn't have armor or lawyers, but they held the whole medieval world up on their backs. So let the salty air fade. Settle into the calm, slow rhythm of the night. Part 5. The Gentle Giants and the Woolly Foundation of Europe. Hey guys! Welcome back. We've spent time with the aggressive warhorses, the snarky monastery cats, and the self-castrating beavers. Now, let's take a deep breath and move to the very quiet center of the medieval world, the farm. These animals didn't have armor or elaborate legal defenses. They weren't exotic pets for kings. They were the economic engine, the heating system, the clothing manufacturer, and the tax base, all wrapped up in hide and fur. Without them, there is no Middle Ages. Full stop. Let's start with the quiet heroes of the harvest, the oxen. Oxen were castrated bulls, trained to pull heavy loads. And in much of Europe, particularly the heavy clay soils of the north, the ox was king. Forget the horse for a second. The horse was too fast, too delicate, and too expensive for the heavy work of pulling the moldboard plow, the massive, deep-cutting plow needed for the open field system. An ox was slow. Very slow. Think of them as the ultimate low-gear, high-torque vehicle. You could yoke 2, 4, or even 8 of them together to pull the plow through the thick, wet soil. This was crucial work. Plowing determined whether you ate or starved. And while they were slow, they were dependable. They didn't need expensive oats. They could eat poor-quality grass and straw. They were docile, manageable, and when their long, honest working life was over, they could be eaten. It was a complete, circular economy. They cost less to keep, they were less likely to run away, and they were significantly less high-strung than any warhorse. The rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the ox pace. The fields were laid out in strips that were just long enough for an ox team to pull the plow before needing to stop and turn around. This unit of measurement was called a furlong or furrow long, and it was literally defined by the breathing capability of the ox. The entire physical structure of the European landscape was shaped by the need to efficiently use a slow, powerful bovine. You can just picture the scene, a gray, misty morning. The peasant is walking behind the slow, rhythmic movement of the team. The creak of the wooden plow. The smell of turned earth. It's a monotonous, back-breaking job, but the ox is the steady partner, never complaining, just pulling. It's the antithesis of the chaotic battlefield. It's the silent foundation. The walking gold mine, medieval sheep. If oxen were the backbone, sheep were the circulatory system of the medieval economy. Specifically, the English sheep. Wool was, for centuries, the equivalent of modern-day oil or high technology. It was Europe's most important trade commodity. The wealth generated by wool built the great cathedrals of England. The English fleece was considered the best in Europe, fine, dense, and ideal for weaving high-quality cloth in Flanders and Italy. Every single part of the sheep was useful. Wool, obviously, for clothing, blankets, and trade. Milk, eaten as cheese, especially by the poor, as it was more common than cow's milk. Mutton, meat, though they were usually slaughtered only when they got too old to produce wool or milk. Pelt, used for parchment, the pages for all those bestiaries we talked about, and for leather. Manure, dung, the ultimate fertilizer. The act of folding the sheep was a serious business. At night, the shepherd would pen the sheep on a specific section of the field to ensure that they deposited their manure there. The soil needed constant enrichment, and the simplest way to get it was to use the sheep as a giant, furry, mobile fertilization unit. This reliance on sheep led to huge social changes, particularly in later medieval England, where large landowners realized they could make more money raising thousands of sheep than renting land to peasants. The phrase, "sheep ate men," became common as landowners would illegally evict tenants to turn arable fields into vast sheep pastures, an early sign of the transition to a more capitalistic system. The quiet, gentle sheep was, ironically, the cause of massive social unrest and displacement. The domestic economy, cow, pig, and chicken. Let's look at the animals you'd find in the village or, as we learned, literally living next to the family. The cow was primarily valued for milk. Unlike the ox, which was a steer, castrated male, and used for labor, the cow was about daily sustenance. But milk was a tricky product in an age before refrigeration. It spoiled quickly, especially in the summer. So, most of the milk was immediately processed into butter and, more importantly, cheese. Cheese was a survival food. It stored well, was portable, and provided vital protein and calories. Every region had its own cheese, often named after the village or monastery that produced it. The rhythmic sound of milking, then churning, then pressing the cheese, was a constant backdrop to medieval domestic life. The pig, as we mentioned, was the great recycler. They were easy to keep because they didn't require prime pasture. They lived in the woods, eating acorns, pannage, or in the village eating garbage and scraps. They turned waste into protein, which is an invaluable skill. When slaughtered, almost every part of the pig was preserved, usually by salting and smoking, to provide fat and meat through the long, lean winter months. They were the original everything but the squeal animal. Finally, the chicken. They were everywhere. They were the most accessible form of animal protein for the very poor. A cow was expensive. A sheep was valuable. But chickens could forage for themselves, and they produced eggs daily. They were cheap, portable, and, best of all, they could hide and reproduce on their own. However, medieval chicken keeping was messy. Chickens roamed freely. They walked into your house. They walked into the church. They scratched up your garden. They were a constant, fluttering source of minor annoyance, but their resilience and prolific egg production made them indispensable. The medieval chicken was the ultimate compromise, a high-maintenance, low-cost tenant that paid its rent in eggs. The emotional gap. What we see in these animals is a profound practicality. The modern Western pet relationship, where the animal is a furry child that provides emotional support and companionship, was rare. The relationship with the ox, the cow, and the sheep was one of brutal necessity. You loved the cow not because it gave great cuddles, but because it kept your children from starving. You were fond of the ox because if it broke its leg, your entire crop failed. The bond was real, often deep, and sometimes spiritual, but it was centered on utility. A farmer might weep when his old ox died, not just from sadness, but from panic over how he would plow next spring. The emotion was tied to the survival of the family. This massive reliance on these gentle, working creatures shows us how close to the line of survival everyone lived. The medieval world was robust, but it was also profoundly fragile. Everything depended on the sun shining, the rain falling, and the silent, slow-moving animals doing their job. It's a quiet testament to the enduring power of these creatures that they literally clothed, fed, and built the great cities and structures of Europe. They didn't get statues or dramatic poems, but they deserved them. They were the foundation. As the sun sets over the medieval fields, you can hear the faint bleating of the sheep being folded for the night, the slow chewing of the oxen in their stalls, and the distant, territorial grunting of a pig. It is the sound of survival. In the next part, we are going to look at the animal's final destination, the medieval menu. We'll talk about what people ate, the difference between noble and peasant diets, and the bizarre courtly rituals involving swans and peacocks. So, let the hum of the farm fade into the dark. Rest your eyes. Part 6. Peacocks, pottage, and the problem with spices. Hey guys. You're doing great. We've covered the working animals, the mythical animals, and the questionable theological status of the beaver. Now, we are entering the final stage of the animal's medieval life, the plate. We are going to move from the quiet stability of the farm to the loud, smelly, and strangely sophisticated world of the medieval kitchen. And trust me, what they did with food was often just as bizarre as what they thought about the elephant. The core distinction in the medieval diet was, as always, class. For the peasant, the diet was overwhelmingly vegetarian, centered on grain. Their animal protein came primarily from the small animals we discussed, the resilient chicken and its eggs, pork, especially bacon/salt pork stored over winter, and fish from the local river or moat. They didn't eat large cuts of beef or mutton often, because those animals were too valuable alive either for labor, oxen, milk, cow, or wool sheep. When a peasant did eat meat, it was usually in the form of a thick, humble stew or soup called pottage. This was slow-cooked all day, often supplemented with pot herbs and whatever scraps of bone or salted meat they could spare. The flavor was likely simple, hearty, and extremely repetitive. The absurdity of noble cuisine. Now, let's float up to the noble table. This is where the animal kingdom became an arena for conspicuous consumption and theatrical performance. The noble diet was based around meat. Lots of it. And the more exotic or difficult the animal was to catch, the better. The most prized meat was venison deer, because it proved the lord had an exclusive hunting forest, the royal forest, and could afford to maintain it. If you were eating deer, You were asserting your feudal power with every bite. The second you left the confines of your forest to poach a deer, you could be killed. So the deer on the plate was an edible declaration of legal supremacy. But the real fun came at great feasts. The cooks weren't just chefs, they were performance artists. Their job wasn't just to feed the guests, but to amaze them. The most famous example is the roasted peacock. You don't just roast a peacock and serve it. That's for peasants. You skin the peacock carefully, roast the body, and then, here's the best part, you sew the skin and the magnificent tail feathers back onto the cooked carcass. It's wheeled out, sometimes with its beak gilded in gold, looking completely alive, perched on a platter. It's essentially a taxidermy prop stuffed with a roasted bird. The taste? Frankly, the meat of the peacock is notoriously tough and dry. It was all about the look. The entire ritual was a massive waste of resources, but it showed you were rich enough to eat something just for the spectacle. They did the same thing with swans. The swan was another noble bird, often reserved for the king's table, and was frequently presented redressed in its own snowy white plumage. Eating a swan was a status symbol of the highest order, but again, the meat was tough and didn't compare to a simple roasted chicken. The spice problem and bizarre preparation. Medieval noble cooking had two primary drivers that affected the use of animals: preservation and showmanship. 1. Hiding the funk. We often hear that people used spices to cover the taste of rancid meat. This is partially true, but also a little snarky. Most wealthy homes killed their meat fresh or preserved it with salt, which was very effective. The real reason for the heavy spice usage was simply that spices were outrageously expensive and therefore another way to show off. If you could afford to grind up a pound of pepper, ginger, and cloves to put in your sauce, you were clearly wealthier than your neighbor. Spices were edible jewels. 2. The pulverization of protein. Medieval cooks were obsessed with pulverizing and coloring food. They would grind up perfectly good meat, chicken, pork, even fish, into a paste. They'd mix it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices, and then color it with saffron, yellow, or spinach, green, or even turnsole, blue/purple. The result was a dish called mortreuse or blancmange, not the wobbly dessert we know today, but a chicken-based white paste. This was done for several reasons. It was considered easier to digest, a high priority for medieval doctors, it stretched the meat, and it allowed the cooks to present food in entirely artificial ways, like molding a fish and almond paste into the shape of a tiny castle, or creating a multicolored checkerboard pattern on the platter. They were masters of food disguise. The animal in the law. Beyond the dining table, the dead animal still carried weight in the medieval law and economy. Tallow and oil. The fat of the animal, tallow from cows/sheep, lard from pigs, was critically important. Tallow was used to make candles for light, a constant necessity in a world without electricity. Lard was used for cooking and was the primary source of cooking fat for the poor. The oil extracted from fish, like whale oil if available, was used in lamps, particularly in churches. The entire economy of light was based on the fat reserves of slaughtered animals. The butcher's role. The butcher was a highly regulated and often heavily taxed profession, usually relegated to a specific area of the town due to the smell and the required waste disposal. The slaughter of animals wasn't hidden away in a factory, it was a visible, bloody part of daily life. The sounds of the animals, the sight of the blood, and the smell of the offal were constant reminders that life required death. A note on hygiene. It is important to remember that all this feasting and consumption occurred without modern refrigeration or sanitation. While the lords used spices and the peasants salted their pork, the general environment was conducive to illness. The waste from the animal, the bones, the offal, the liquid runoff from the butcher's stalls, was a major source of urban filth and disease. The flies and rodents were, as always, an active part of the environment, feasting on the leftovers of the feast. It's a classic ironic contrast: immense, spectacular wealth built upon a biological foundation that was only ever one hot summer away from a major plague. We've now followed the animals from the field to the feather-adorned platter. We've seen their use as labor, as status, and as sustenance. In the next part, we are going to pivot entirely and look at the animals in healing and medicine. We will talk about the bizarre remedies medieval doctors prescribed, involving everything from snakes to dog poop, and how animal parts were used, with earnest conviction, to treat everything from headaches to the plague. So, let the image of that stiff, proud peacock fade away. Dim the lights just a little more. We're moving now from the kitchen to the apothecary's shop. Part 8. Lions rampant and eagles displayed, the language of heraldry. Hey guys! You're doing wonderfully. We are now floating away from the medieval sickroom, leaving behind the unfortunate fox grease and the powdered worms. We're moving to the Great Hall, which is now dominated by bright colors, heavy tapestries, and the metallic clatter of armor. We are entering the world of heraldry, which is where animals cease to be biological creatures and become purely symbols of a noble's identity, power, and often their inflated ego. In the Middle Ages, particularly in battle, you needed a giant billboard stuck to your chest and your shield to tell people exactly who you were. Everyone in your army, or everyone you were about to stab, needed to know your name, your family, and your status, because your face was completely covered by that heavy, hot metal bucket we call a great helm. This need for instant, visual ID gave rise to the elaborate system of coats of arms. And what was the star of the show? The animals, of course. The big five: power, fury, and piety. The creatures chosen for heraldry were not arbitrary. They were selected for the qualities they were believed to possess. A heraldic device wasn't just a decoration, it was a psychological statement. Lion faced the lion. The lion was, without question, the most popular and powerful charge, the central image, in heraldry. It was the king of beasts, symbolizing courage, valor, and strength. If you put a lion on your shield, you were saying, I am the strongest guy here, and I dare you to try me. The way the lion was posed was critical. You rarely see a lion just standing around looking bored. Rampant. This is the classic pose, standing on its hind legs, claws out, roaring. It means ready to fight. The most famous example is the lion on the royal arms of England. Passant guardant, walking, but looking directly at the viewer, like the three lions of the current English coat of arms. It's a statement of vigilance. The lion wasn't native to Europe, of course. Most people had never seen one, except maybe the sad, meat and wine-fed lion at the Tower of London. But they knew the idea of the lion from the Bible and the Bestiaries. It was the perfect, abstract symbol of nobility. Eagle the eagle. The eagle was the runner-up for power, reserved primarily for emperors and those claiming descent from Roman authority. It symbolized power, majesty, and lofty ambition. The Roman Empire used the eagle, and so did the Holy Roman Empire, usually displayed as a fearsome, two-headed monster, an eagle displayed with two heads, symbolizing dominion over both East and West, or the spiritual and the temporal. If you had an eagle on your crest, you were declaring that you flew high above the petty politics of the local barons. You were basically telling everyone you were a BFD, flown in from a historical, imperial past. Wolf faced the wolf and the boar. These were often used by the less historically minded or the more aggressive nobles. The wolf symbolized ferocity, vigilance, and persistence. It was the crest of a border lord, someone constantly fighting to defend their territory. The boar symbolized bravery and relentless aggression. You put a boar on your shield when you wanted to communicate a dangerous, stubborn willingness to fight to the death. The boar was also highly favored by Scottish clans, a nod to the difficult, tough-skinned nature of the animal and, by extension, the clan itself. Ram the lamb. Not everyone was trying to be terrifying. Animals were also used to symbolize piety and spiritual qualities. The lamb, Agnus Dei, was a common symbol for monasteries, towns, and individuals wanting to emphasize their peacefulness, innocence, and connection to Christ, the Lamb of God. It was the visual equivalent of wearing a hair shirt, a public statement of humility, often made by people who could definitely afford a lion but chose to project goodness instead. The rules of the heraldic zoo. Heraldry was governed by incredibly strict, pedantic rules, managed by professional officials called heralds. These were the fashion police of the medieval battlefield, making sure no one was trying to pass off their rouncy horse as a destrier on their shield. Color, tincture. There were rules about what colors could touch. You couldn't put metal on metal, gold on silver, or color on color, red on blue. This was because the purpose was identification, and contrasting colors showed up best on a muddy battlefield. The mythical beasts. This is where the bestiaries came back to haunt the armorers. The most popular mythical animal was the griffin, part eagle, part lion, symbolizing vigilance and valor. The dragon, often symbolizing defense of treasure, and the wyvern, a two-legged dragon, symbolizing pestilence or war, were also common. Confusion as status. Sometimes, the more confusing and unique your beast was, the better. A noble might invent a new hybrid, a hedgehog dormant or a salamander surrounded by flames, just to ensure their heraldry was instantly distinguishable and showed their wealth in being able to afford a creative herald. Animals and personal mottos. The animal charge was often paired with a motto, a snappy phrase that summarized the family's philosophy. The two worked together to create a full persona. For example, a noble with a stag's head, symbolizing one who will not fight unless forced, might pair it with a motto like Semper Paratus, always prepared. The stag is gentle, but the motto suggests it's not to be messed with. It's all very carefully crafted PR. In the end, the animal on the shield was more important than the animal in the field. A Destrier could die, a favorite hound could run away, but the lion rampant on your banner was immortal. It was the permanent, simplified, and slightly exaggerated version of your family's worth. Heraldry provided a crucial service. It transformed the unpredictable, messy reality of the animal kingdom into a predictable, coded, and beautiful system of human status. They took the fear out of the lion, put it on a piece of paper, and then wore it to scare other people. As we finish looking at the shimmering banners and polished shields, let's leave the noise of the Great Hall. The sun is now fully set. The castle is quiet. In the next part, we are going to look at the spiritual and philosophical side of animals in the Middle Ages. We'll talk about the role of animals in religious art and pilgrimage, their place in Eden, and the strange, quiet lives of relic animals, the holy creatures that were revered and even collected by the church. So, let the image of the furious lion on the shield settle into the background. Slow your breathing. The night is long, and we have nowhere to be. Part 9. The Serpent in Eden and the Spirituality of Skin. Hey guys. We're deep into the quiet hours now. We've dimmed the lights, we've covered the battlefield, the kitchen, and the pharmacy. Now we turn our attention to the one realm that truly dominated the medieval mind, the spiritual. The animals in the Middle Ages weren't just economic assets or terrifying monsters. They were deeply integrated into the fabric of Christian theology and symbolism. They were God's commentary on humanity, present from the very start, and they often held positions of strange, sometimes disturbing, sanctity. The beginning and the end, Eden and the apocalypse. Animals played a crucial, defining role in the medieval understanding of the cosmos, starting with the very first story, Eden. The entire moral order of the world was established with a few choice animals. The serpent, of course, was the ultimate villain. He was the voice of cunning and deceit, the symbol of Satan, and the ultimate cause of the fall of man. This gave the snake a terrible spiritual reputation that persisted throughout the Middle Ages, making it the least desirable animal to encounter unless it was ground up and put into an antidote, which, as we know, was a whole separate business. Conversely, the medieval view of paradise was also filled with animals. Paintings and illustrations of Eden often show a gentle world where the lion lies down with the lamb, the perfect, prelapsarian state where animals were not predatory and humans ruled them peacefully. This image of restored harmony was a powerful promise of what the end of days would bring. But the most potent symbolism came from the four creatures surrounding Christ in Revelation, the four living creatures. These were seen in religious art and manuscript illumination everywhere. The lion Mark, the ox Luke, the man/angel Matthew, the eagle John. These weren't just symbols, they were the evangelists themselves, represented as powerful, winged beasts surrounding the throne of God. They elevated these animals to the highest spiritual plane, integrating them directly into the story of salvation. Holy animals and relic worship. This strong spiritual association led to some truly bizarre practices, namely the creation and veneration of animal relics. We think of relics as the bones of saints or splinters of the true cross. But the medieval church and its followers also collected, with great reverence, items associated with miraculous or holy animals. The most sought-after animal relic was the unicorn horn, which, as we established, came from a creature that did not exist. The horn, which was actually the tusk of a narwhal, a type of whale, was believed to be a guaranteed antidote to poison. Popes and kings bought these tusks for staggering sums, keeping them in elaborate, jeweled mounts. They were viewed as a religious artifact because of the unicorn's association with Christ. Owning one was both a spiritual and physical safeguard. Then there were the truly strange relics, like the feathers of the Holy Ghost. Sometimes, these were described as actual feathers that dropped from the Holy Spirit when it appeared as a dove. The reality was usually a bird feather given a beautiful name and sold to a pilgrim for a hefty price. And let's not forget the story of Saint Guinefort, the holy dog. This is a beautiful, sad, and slightly heretical tale from France. The story goes that a knight's favorite greyhound, Guinefort, was found standing over the cradle of the knight's baby, covered in blood. The knight immediately assumed the dog had killed the child and fatally stabbed it. Then he heard the baby cry and saw a dead snake lying nearby. Guinefort had actually saved the baby from the snake. The knight and his wife were devastated. They buried the dog with honors in a well, and soon, people began visiting the dog's grave to ask for help, particularly for sick children. The local peasantry started venerating Guinefort as a saint. The church, of course, was furious. You cannot worship a dog. But the cult persisted for centuries, a beautiful, gentle, and stubborn example of people applying the concept of sainthood to a truly good, heroic animal. The monastic relationship. In the silent, controlled world of the monastery, the relationship with animals was perhaps the most balanced. The monks saw themselves as the inheritors of Saint Francis of Assisi, who preached that all creatures were brothers and sisters under God. Monks were often excellent naturalists, not in a scientific sense, but in an observant one. They cared for their fish ponds, their poultry, and their gardens with a sense of stewardship. The gentle rhythm of monastic life included the animals, such as the famous cat who was the monk's companion, or the monastery dog trained to find the path in the snow. One of the great moral debates involving animals concerned their souls. Did animals have one? The consensus of the theologians was a firm no. Animals were created by God purely for human use, and they did not possess the rational soul, anima rationalis, required for salvation. This belief, of course, is what made the pig trials so bizarre. If the pig didn't have a soul, how could it be held morally and legally accountable for its sins? It was a contradiction the medieval mind was comfortable living with. The animal as metaphor for sin. If some animals symbolized Christ and the evangelists, others were perfect metaphors for every human failing. These images were used constantly in sermons and stained glass to teach the illiterate masses about morality. The fox, always a symbol of cunning, hypocrisy, and heresy, often depicted stealing a goose while dressed as a monk. The goat, a classic symbol of lust and lewdness, a theme the goat has never quite shaken. The monkey, a symbol of vanity and mischief, representing the fallen, corrupted version of humanity, man without God's grace. These animal parables gave life to abstract ideas. It was much easier to understand the sin of hypocrisy when you saw a painting of a sly fox pretending to prey. It paints a picture of a world saturated with animal meaning. From the snake that ruined everything, to the unicorn that promised healing, to the beasts that flanked the God of Revelation, the animals were never just animals. They were living theology. As we drift away from the stained glass windows and the quiet contemplation of the monastery, we have almost completed our circuit. We've seen animals as friends, food, weapons, and symbols. In the final part, we are going to look briefly at the people who worked with the animals: the falconers, the shepherds, the hunters, and the pig keepers. We will discuss their status, their unique cultures, and how their specific animal connection defined their place in the rigid social structure of the Middle Ages. So, let the spiritual symbolism gently wash away. Just the quiet sound of your breathing. Part 10. Swineherds, falconers, and the social hierarchy of smells. Hey guys! We are on the home stretch now, and we're going to spend this part focusing on the humans whose lives were completely defined by the specific animals they kept. This is about the medieval social structure, which was so rigid that even the animal you worked with determined your status, income, and, frankly, how you smelled. In the medieval world, everyone had a job and a place, and often that place was inseparable from a certain creature. The apex, the falconer. At the very top of the specialized animal professions was the falconer. If the king's master falconer walked into a room, you paid attention. This job was exclusive, high status, and required an enormous amount of specialized, secret knowledge. The falconer was an essential member of the nobility's inner circle. They were often trusted confidants, perhaps because they spent so much time alone, doing the delicate, high-stakes work of training raptors. They understood the language of silence and discipline. Status, extremely high. They worked directly for the lord or king. They were often handsomely paid, and their clothing, while functional, was usually high quality. The vibe, reserved, intense, and always carrying a bird that could literally tear a smaller creature apart. This gave them an air of power by proxy. Their expertise was complex and could not be faked. If your bird didn't fly straight, you were out of a job and possibly out of a head. The engine, the marshal and the grooms. Just below the falconer was the marshal, or marshal, the chief officer responsible for the king's horses and the specialized grooms who worked under him. This was a position of immense logistical power. Remember, horses were the military hardware and the transportation system of the age. Status, very high. The marshal was often a noble himself, controlling a vast budget for feed, tack, and personnel. The king's personal groom, sometimes called the master of the horse, was privy to private conversations and secrets. The vibe? Busy, commanding, and practical. They had to be experts in veterinary care, breeding, and logistics, planning the feed for thousands of horses on a campaign. They lived and breathed the smell of hay and leather, and they understood the true cost of war, which was mostly measured in oats. The outsider, the shepherd. Now, let's float down to the village and look at the shepherd. We talked about the importance of sheep in part 5, but the shepherd's social status was a fascinating contrast to their animal's economic worth. Status, low but essential. Shepherds were often solitary figures, forced by their job to live on the fringes of society, away from the village, spending months alone with the flock. The vibe, mystical, isolated, and highly resourceful. Because of their isolation, they were often viewed with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They were thought to know secret cures and folk magic, because who else could manage a flock of hundreds of sheep through the wilds and the wolves without some kind of supernatural help? They were the original outsiders, quietly making the money that funded the whole feudal project. The lowly recycler, the swineherd. At the bottom of the hierarchy of animal professionals was the swineherd, or pig keeper. This was a crucial, necessary job, but it was despised. Status, lowest of the low. The swineherd's entire life was associated with filth, muck, and the very pungent reality of the pig. They were often segregated from the rest of the community. The vibe, smelly, loud, and robust. Their smell was their social marker. In a world with a high tolerance for bad smells, the swineherd stood out. This was a man whose daily life involved sorting garbage and navigating mud and feces, and that stickiness followed him. Yet, without him, the village would drown in its own waste, and there would be no pork to preserve for winter. He was a perfect, ironic example of an absolutely vital role being treated with utter contempt. The hunters and the poachers. We must also touch on the specialized role of the hunter. This was the nobleman's favorite pastime, and the yeoman archer's skill. The relationship with the hunting animal, the dog or the hawk, defined this group. Hunting was not just a sport, it was military training disguised as a leisure activity. It kept the knights sharp and their horses fit. It required a deep, practical understanding of animal behavior, tracking, and the land. The poacher, of course, was the illegal version of the hunter, a peasant trying to get a deer to feed his starving family. His entire existence was defined by the risk of interacting with the king's animals. If caught killing the king's deer, The penalty was often blinding or death. The deer itself wasn't worth the penalty, but the king's right to the deer was. The animal was the catalyst for the ultimate class struggle. The quiet conclusion. When you look at the medieval world through the lens of animal professions, you see the entire social structure laid bare. The falconer on high, touching the sky, managing an aerial weapon. The marshal in the stable, surrounded by expensive, powerful horses. The shepherd alone on the hills, counting the woolly money. The swineherd in the mud, handling the waste. Your animal connection was your destiny. It dictated who would talk to you, what you could wear, and where you were allowed to live. It was a life of profound specialization, constant labor, and inescapable biological reality. And with that, we have journeyed from the quiet monastery to the bloody battlefield, from the heights of heraldry to the depths of the hog pen. We've reached the end of our gentle, long ramble through the noisy, smelly, and strangely fascinating world of medieval animals. I hope that by now, you are thoroughly relaxed, your eyes are heavy, and your mind is full of slow-moving oxen, proud redressed peacocks, and the persistent, quiet hum of a society built entirely on the backs of its beasts. Thank you for floating with me tonight. Good night.